Morning all. Can you hear me okay? Morning everybody. Welcome to day 2 of this summer school. Today, day 2, we have 2 very, very interesting panel discussions this morning. And we're going to focus on voice, choice and community for disabled children and young people. I'm going to introduce the panel members as we go, if that's okay. I'll introduce myself maybe to begin with. My name is Colm O'Connell. I'm Head of Disability and Youth Division in the Department of Community, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. It's a bit of a mouthful. We've quite a large mandate in the department. What's of note, I guess, as well, is that we recently took on this Irish Department of Children, Equality and Disability has recently taken on responsibilities since last March for specialist community-based disability services, and we obviously had a pre-existing mandate in relation to a cross-government approach to disability equality policy. So that's enough about me. I'm going to, as I say, introduce in a bit more depth the panelists as we go. But our first panel member, we're going to have 3 presentations in a row from Cliona, from Ellen and from Petra. On the first panel, our first panel is going to consider equal recognition before the law. So the panel will explore the application of the right to equal recognition before the law to children and young people, with a particular focus on maximising their autonomy, opportunities to access support and innovative practices. Cliona, by the way, maybe you were congratulating her yesterday. Recently, a doctor, she's a postdoctoral researcher here at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at the University of Galway. And her presentation, which she's now going to make, will focus or pick up on some aspects of her doctorate. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cliona de Vélis for a presentation for about the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to the next 2 panelists in order, and we'll then have open questions from the floor and from those watching by Zoom at home or in your office, and we're looking forward to a very good discussion on this topic. Thank you very much. Cliona.
Thank you, Colm. Good morning, everyone. As we've just heard in this morning's panel, we're going to discuss equal recognition before the law. And very specifically, I think a lot of the presentations that you're going to hear are going to think about how children and young people with disabilities can be involved and respected in decision-making about their lives. So I'm going to try and set the scene a little bit with my first presentation. I'm going to talk to you about the articles that talk about this and the conventions, what they mean, and how maybe we can interpret them, because as you've heard, I've just spent about four and a bit years thinking about this in doing my PhD and trying to examine how that might apply to disabled children and young people. We've already heard a bit about some of these concepts yesterday from Brona and from some of the questions that we had in some of the morning sessions and indeed from our keynote when we talked about guardianship and some of the various other ideas. So you'll have already heard concepts such as legal capacity, self-determination, and even some of the articles in the conventions that are relevant. Brona would have mentioned them to us under the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Like yesterday, I'll do my very best to cut down on the acronyms, but those 2 might slip out of just practice and overuse at this point. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start by explaining some of those concepts in more detail, and actually in particular one that maybe we didn't get an awful lot of time to talk about yesterday, and that would be Article 12 of the CRPD. Article 12 of the CRPD is on equal recognition before the law, so the title for this morning's panel. But I suppose more specifically, the elements of it that we will think about quite a bit are the aspects of it that talk about that persons with disabilities should enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others, and some of those aspects. Essentially, legal capacity in this way means that they should have the right to make decisions which have legal consequences on an equal basis with others. The law should respect those decisions and not take away that right. And we've heard, as I said, a bit about this already. Because for years, and as we heard yesterday, many countries still are denying people from making these decisions about their lives. They often do this for a whole host of different reasons or using different tests or criterias. No captions?
Captions. The voice is interrupting the captions.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Can you hear me now? Can we test the captions again?
Thumbs up.
Yes, but I still don't see any captions.
I can hear you. I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So now Zoom is speaking over. Maybe if everyone on Zoom goes on mute.
Can you ask everybody on Zoom to go on mute? And
Perfect, yeah. I'm getting thumbs up at the back there, I think.
okay. We'll try this again.
Yeah.
And hopefully the sign language interpreters will wave me down. Also, hopefully you won't have to wave me down if I speed up too much. I often get that with sign language interpreters and captioners too. What I was talking about was Article 12 of the CRPD. Article 12 stands for equal recognition before the law. And in particular, one of the aspects that we're going to focus on this morning is around its decision-making or the legal capacity element of it. And it says that persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others. And this is because, or as a result of, I think, for many years, and still, as we heard yesterday in presentations from our keynote and many others, that disabled people were denied this right and continue to be denied this right for a whole host of different reasons. That can happen just because a person is disabled in a particular country, that their law is written or set up to deny them automatically those rights. It can happen because they are viewed as making a bad decision or something other people don't agree with, and then cases are taken or moves are made to make sure that they are denied that right. Or because a test is carried out and they are analysed and found not to have enough mental capacity or decision-making ability as other people. And this will, of course, impact some people with certain types of disabilities or impairment more than others, or that is what we've seen over the years. So you might be more likely to face this test if you have a cognitive disability or if you have a speech or communication impairment and you can't articulate yourself, than you are if you are somebody there shouting about rights like I am currently in the front row of an auditorium. But that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody would not, couldn't be subject to some of these tests. So Article 12 then came about, and the CRPD clearly states that they have legal capacity on an equal basis with others. And then on the first general comment that the committee wrote, and a general comment is a document that the committee writes which explains in more detail the content of the articles and what they mean by them and what states have to do to make them happen. So the general comment that they wrote on Article 12 stated that a denial of legal capacity which is either discriminatory in purpose or effect have to be denied. So you have to get rid of all of these mechanisms if they are discriminating or could discriminate against disabled people. So we're thinking about the ones that I've just talked about there. Are you going to more likely to be tested or face the test if you have a cognitive disability for one of these things? In which case is that not discriminatory? Are you more likely to have your decisions questioned or the status idea? All of these different types of ways to stop people from making decisions have to be removed under Article 12. And instead, what we should be looking at is, instead of appointing people to make decisions for other people, taking away these rights and appointing people under substituted decision-making regimes is what the committee calls them. We should be supporting people to make decisions, giving them access to support, recognising that we all turn to somebody else at various points and ask for help, making things accessible, and recognising the types of support and who we might want to support us in those ways. So that's what the general comment on Article 12 says in a very whistle-stop tour. It says that we should be supporting people to make decisions based on their will and preferences. So basically what they would like, their overall picture of a good life, their likes and dislikes, and instead of stepping in and making decisions based on their best interests. But what we don't know yet, or what we're not yet very well aware of, is how exactly this applies to children and young people. There is a short paragraph in the general comment that says that states parties must examine their laws to ensure that the will and preferences of children with disabilities are respected on an equal basis with other children. Okay, how does that work? Exactly. What else do we do with that, and how do we apply that more generally? I started to think about this for my PhD and going, okay, what does that mean in more detail? And how do we balance some of the contents that we have in other areas that Brona will have talked about yesterday under Article 7 with some of these aspects? So to start with, I think if we just look at when there is a decision in law, when there is a rule set out in law about when somebody can make a decision. This might happen in certain countries for a whole host of different reasons, but one of the most common ones that I thought about when I was thinking, or one of the common examples that I think is helpful to think about, is if somebody has an age set out in law for when you might consent to medical treatment. A lot of countries might say that, say, at 16, somebody is allowed to consent to medical treatment, but you're usually an adult in that country and allowed to make most other decisions at 18, right? So that's a rule that applies to children and young people because they are a child still, they are under 18, but it's a decision that the law recognises that they can make at that younger age. And for me, I think the way Article 12 is written and the way that this statement is made in the general comment, it's very clear that that then means that we can't apply these tests that are unfair. If we think they're unfair for adults, we shouldn't also be applying them to children and young people at those stages. So what we should be saying is if that age is set out in law, that should apply to all children and young people who that might apply to. That age limit should apply to all of them. We should not be then going, but you can if you can pass this test. You can if you can reach this certain challenge, or you can if it is not something we consider a very bad decision and therefore we're going to take away your decision-making rights. There's some other aspects of that with best interests, which I'll get into a little bit later if I have time. But in general, I feel that that is one of the criteria. If that is applied for one group of children, then it should be fair and not discriminate and be applied to all groups of children in line with Article 12. We should also make sure that these groups have access to support and that we're doing this and helping them articulate and make decisions based on their will and preferences and figure out their will and preferences at that stage. So if, we don't automatically presume that we don't always know exactly what supports we want or need in different situations. So people should have chances to figure out what that is, especially at that age. But it should also be something that we do, that we give people chances, that we have opportunities to bring somebody in with you to that appointment at 16 if that's what you want. That you have opportunities to have accessible information if that is the support that you would prefer. That there's different ways and measures that we can put in place to make sure that that is accessible for people. Those are the age limits set out in law, but many decisions that we make at that age don't have set criteria set out in law. There might not be a structured idea where we're like, and at this exact age, there is a very clear rule in law. And what do we do in those situations? Well, that is where the other thing that we heard about yesterday, Article 7 of the CRPD, comes in. Article 7 of the CRPD says that states parties shall ensure that children with disabilities have the right to express their views freely on all matters affecting them, their views being given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity on an equal basis with other children, and to be provided with disability and age-appropriate assistance to realise that right. So there's a lot in there. I'm going to break it down in smaller chunks if we can. But it is essentially going that even when children don't have the authority maybe always to make the final decision, like I've just talked about consent to medical treatment in some of those areas, or that set age limit set out in law, that still doesn't mean they don't have a right to express their views or participate in decision making and to influence what is happening and tell people what they think. So they have the right to express their view freely on all matters affecting them. And their views then, what they say then, should be given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. It is on all matters affecting them, and as we heard from Brona yesterday, it has dropped the language that we saw in the CRPD of capable of forming a view, so it's no longer contingent on people having enough capacity or being capable in one way or the other. They also then have to have their views being given due weight. Now, we don't have any more information immediately from the CRPD committee on this, but we do have a number of authors and articles on the CRC committee and different things that I drew on to figure out what this might mean and how this would operate in practice for children and young people with disabilities. And finally, one of the other, or the most important element of this, I think the interesting addition to this at the end, was to be provided with disability and age-appropriate assistance to realise that right. So for that, if we think back to the idea of support, we're bringing that back in here again. We are not presuming that people will just get on with this. Okay, you have it, off you go now, good luck. We are recognising that people are interdependent, that sometimes we might need things in a more accessible way, that we turn to certain people, that we have to change the way we do our practices to make sure that they are inclusive and accessible so that children and young people with disabilities have the same opportunities to do this. I think when we read this and we were thinking about how this would work, that it means if you read this in the same treaty as Article 12, it cannot include capacity assessments. It wouldn't make sense for the two set to work together within the one major treaty. But it does include ways that, how do we get this operational? How does this make sense if we're thinking about it? What is due weight and how all of that worked? So in doing this, drawing on some of the information I gathered from the young people in my study and the other information that was available from the different treaty bodies and various authors on the idea, I developed a 3-stage process or a model for how this might be done. I called it the ask, listen, or interpret and respond idea. And it builds on some of the work of Professor Laura Lundy, who's done an awful lot of work in this area on Article 12 of the CRC and how that might apply to children and young people generally and the steps and the areas that are needed for that. But also drawing on Dr. Jo Watson's work with people who use unintentional or non-traditional, I think, is some of, there's different ways of describing this communication. And I don't know that there is a preferred term, but if you have one or if you think of different things, I'd love to hear it. But when I'm thinking about this cohort, I'm thinking of people who don't maybe use symbolic language, who don't always use speech or write things down in a way that everybody else would understand. Maybe even they don't have access to assistive technology all the time to help them to do this. So they might be relying on gestures, vocalizations, body language, and people just who know them really well to figure out what they think. And I think they should also need to be included in all of these ways and if we're thinking about it. So I drew on some of Dr. Jo Watson's work and went, okay, how do we mesh these things together, plus the findings that I have from the other things, to create an idea that makes sure that most children and every child and young person has a chance in this and gets a chance to express their views. So it starts by asking them. Ask is the first step. And by ask, I mean that we acknowledge that every child has preferences and views. We start from that basis. We're not saying, I'm sorry they don't communicate that way, I'm sorry I can't understand what they mean, and excluding some children. We are looking around and going, everybody has things they like and don't like. We can always figure out something from people. We can always do that sort of work. And we start from that. We acknowledge that absolutely everybody has that. Then we make sure that we are creating an environment which is suitable and accessible. We provide them information in a way that's accessible, and we really think about how we can structure this process to support them to take part. And then we actively seek their views. It is not good enough for adults to sit by, chat amongst themselves and go, well, sure, they were there. They could have spoken up if they wanted, right? They could have said something. We have to think about how often children and young people, disabled children and young people, have not been asked, and how they might not want to jump up and down and go, but me, because they just aren't used to maybe being asked in some situations. Sure, that came out in some of the people in my research who were like, oh, sure, they weren't going to listen to me anyway. right? So we have to make sure that we're actively seeking somebody's views. Of course, participation is a right, it's not a duty, and some people might go, well, I don't want to take part in this exercise, I don't know what I think right now, but I think we need to make it accessible and give them the information and give them every chance to take part. And also, often when we think about that right and not a duty, I think we think about like large-scale consultations as if we were taking part in a big survey in this room, and not about what do you think about that school that we were thinking of going to, or that surgery that was going to happen, or something that is deeply personal and individual to the person. After we've asked, then we need to make sure that we listen. We actively listen to what they are saying. We don't listen and go, well, I think they mean something else that suits me better anyway. We actively listen and engage to what the child in front of us is saying. And we carefully observe and interpret if they're using non-traditional communication. And that's where the interpret comes into this. It's not enough to say we're just listening and, well, sure, they're not saying anything and dismissing it. We have to be careful. We have to observe and interpret. And by interpret there, I am very clear about like reading what we think they mean from what we know about them, using communication passports, building pictures with people who know and love them to develop what they're saying, and not interpreting something through a very adult lens and making up our own ideas about this suits us better. It's very much what the child is doing. And finally, we have to respond. We have to make sure that we are giving due weight to what they are saying based on their age and maturity, right? So we have to ensure that they have some influence over the decision, and we explain to them what that might be and how the process will work, and we respond to what they are telling us. And then we are applying this idea of due weight or age and maturity in a way that very much maximises their autonomy. Like I said, capacity, age, all of these things for disabled people have been used over the years to minimise their say-so in their life. But I don't think that's what they should be used for, or what maybe they were even originally addressed to do. So Laura Lundy in some of her work says that there were like generous and broad interpretations of these things were the original ideas behind some of these for the CRC. So why not do that in a way that maximises a young person's autonomy and starts from that thinking? So if we're looking at age, are we looking around and going, would, take, or what decisions are other children doing at this age, and are we making sure they're getting the same chances as their peers? It's very clear that then this becomes their biological age. I am not talking about mental age here, because we know that that has been used to limit people and is not, it holds people back in many, many ways. So look around and look to do that and make sure, is there disability coming in this for me? Would another child of their age be allowed to make this choice? Would I take them more seriously? And in which case, I really need to think about this myself and challenge that. And finally, look for a range for maturity then. If we're making sure that everybody is getting those chances, the next stage up is maturity. And how can we give them maybe more weight and extra weight? That's an additional step up factor. So age is how we make sure they're getting the same chances and we're trying to think about it as everybody else. And then maturity is the way that we look at it in terms of getting, we can give them more weight or more influence. And this including might be even giving as far as almost the final say in decision making or how that might work. That might be a range of factors. So I'm thinking maturity in a whole different ways. It is not just your understanding of something, which is often very, very close to capacity, but it can be your experience. It can be experience. And I think we should think about a whole host of different ways that this works. Does the 8-year-old have lots and lots of experience of surgeries, and therefore they're much better placed than the 16-year-old or anybody else to go, I don't want that, that was terrible last time, we want to do it differently, or I need you to be careful. Can we think about how we're engaging with them and acknowledging what the person they are in front of us, and lots of different ways that aren't based on ableist standards, including information. And then, as I said, of course, we explain this process. And when we've explained the process, we might have to go back to listening again because they might have something else to sell us. And there might be some back and forth in this. These decisions are never a one-way street. Now, I think I'm out of time. So before I break all of my own rules in keeping people to time, I might leave it there. But I will look forward to your questions and answers later in the session.
Thank you very much, Cliona. Very, very interesting, very practical, on Articles 7 and 12 of the Convention, and in particular the three-step model, and building on the work of others, Laura Rundy, you said, and others. And we'll hear more about that, and you can have a chance to ask Cliona questions when we open it up to the floor. But we're going to move along to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ellen Murray. Brief introduction. Ellen has worked for over a decade in the LGBTQI sector. Ellen established the Belfast Trans Resource Centre in 2016, and Ellen is currently Executive Director of Transgender Northern Ireland, excuse me. And aside from being members of various advisory panels and all the rest, really crucially, Ellen is the mother of a lovely orange cat called Bilbo, and co-author of her first published book, How to Be a Good Boy. So the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be listening to Ellen Murray. Thank you.
Good morning. The reason I mention my cat is because he's much better known than I will ever be. And I thought we'd have just taken over the whole island there, but no, we're just in the north for now. So my name is Ellen, as introduced. I've been working in LGBT rights since 2013, and my particular area of interest for the last 5 or so years has been the intersection between LGBT experiences and disability. And I've been researching that and its connections to a bit of an ongoing culture war here in the English-speaking world, in much of the global north in particular at the moment, especially in relation to transgender children and young people. Now, to a lot of people, this seems like a tenuous connection to disability, but hopefully I'll explain over the next little while how anti-disability arguments are, to be honest, increasingly central to this huge media campaign that we're seeing across multiple countries over the last couple of years. So in terms of some recent history, and I'm talking today about transgender children and young people, gender diverse children, any child that's exploring their gender or that understands that to be different than what was assumed assigned to them at birth. It's a fairly broad collection of young people, but we have seen a relatively good progression in Ireland, north and south, across much of the world in the last 20 years with relation to the rights of children and young people in this area. In general, we saw developments in rights to education, rights in healthcare, which increasingly focused on a child's own ability to consent and understand their own medical needs in their social context, and also their rights in recognition before the law, legal gender recognition in some countries, but also just equal legal standing in relation to the rest of their peers. And in a number of countries, this also contained a relatively good understanding of legal capacity with respect to disabled children and young people, but unfortunately, that's starting to take a turn now. So I've been researching mostly the religious right in North America, in the UK, in Ireland, and in Eastern Europe for the past 5 or so years. It is the most well-organised part of the movements behind these sort of anti-disability arguments that we're seeing currently. And as I'll hopefully explain, they mostly focus on a disabled child's or a young person's ability to make their own decisions, to have legal recognition before the law, equal recognition before the law, and to make decisions about their own social life as they develop. So since 2016, but emerging from the 1990s, we're currently in the middle of a bit of a culture war. Culture wars come and go. They're very politically useful tools. And LGBT people are no strangers to culture wars. Indeed, in the 70s through to the 1990s, there were many. This new one is much more laser focused on transgender people in general, but also more specifically within that group to children and young people. Culture wars often focus on children and young people because it sort of advertises to society's innate desire to want to protect children. A lot of this current movement that we're seeing, if you have been reading newspapers or watching the news in, to be honest, in most countries in the global north recently, transgender topics have been a huge proportion of cultural issues over the last couple of years. The beginnings of this, what the human rights community refers to as the anti-gender movement, started really in the 1990s from a couple of very specific Christian churches, but has broadened massively since then. And we've seen huge spikes since 2014, and the biggest spike in this area of anti-rights work to date since 2019, just before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm not sure what COVID did to a lot of people, but it was very useful in recruiting in similar ways to some other conspiracy theory. COVID has been very useful in recruiting normal people to the ranks of these movements. Now, up until this point, the movement or the developments in the rights of children and young people who are questioning the gender or exploring themselves or who are trying to transition have been relatively linear in the direction of progress. And the major themes have been have been allowing children to express themselves, to communicate their identity as they understand it to the people in their lives, and to make decisions in their day-to-day life that reflect that make their life easier. The major themes of what we're currently seeing in many countries around the world focus on those topics as well. Challenging whether a child can understand themselves, to understand that as a child before they turn 18 or to their age of majority in their country, can they understand their gender or more broadly their sexual orientation or gender before adulthood? Should a child be accommodated in that in their day-to-day life, whether that's in school, whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in their family life? Should a child be able to make changes with respect to themselves and to others? And can a child, as Cliona touched on earlier, can a child consent to medical intervention, which is often one of the areas of focus in media discussions around this topic because it is seen as the least temporary intervention. Now, where does it connect to disability? A lot of the arguments that we see in this area of anti-rights work is less so specifically anti-LGBT or anti-trans and more against the decision-making rights of disabled children and young people. There is a very specific focus in this particular area of social policy at the moment to focus on the disabled cohort within the group of transgender young people. And this expands more broadly to sexual orientation and gender minorities as a whole. In general, the assumption is made is that there is a lack of capacity to make decisions regarding self-expression and identity and the ability to consent to medical treatment if that's required. So what that means is because the trans community has a lot of disabled people within it, significantly more than the general population, that is used to stoke alarm, to cause concern, where it would not otherwise be warranted, to prevent access to services in general. In particular, neurodivergence is a particular focus, and the experiences of autistic children and young people are constantly seen in these discussions, and autistic people and autistic activists are no strangers to their infantilization and the suggestion that they cannot make, that autistic people can't make their own decisions and can't be trusted with that. But this is a particular focus from these movements at the moment. And the cited reasons for this are often a proposed vulnerability to social contagion, that they see other children and young people coming out and transitioning or expressing themselves, and they are proposed to be vulnerable to this as well. And also a peer pressure to fit in. Now, this has been seen many times over the last number of decades on all sorts of issues. This is just the most recent. Another proposed vulnerability of transgender children and young people is manipulation by parents, which is also something that is not new. This is just a relatively recent focus of this allegation, that parents are complicit in some form of social contagion. Also then that that exploring your gender or transitioning as a child or young person is a symptom of a mental health condition of either the child or the parent. Quite bizarrely, and we're seeing this particularly in North America, in both the US and Canada, and also in parts of Eastern Europe, and in particular the Eastern Balkans at the moment, the idea that disabled young people having access to the sort of information that would allow them to understand themselves is in and of itself is an information hazard and is inherently damaging. So in the US, we're seeing this at the moment with children's books that are age appropriate on LGBT issues being advertised as predatory to vulnerable, disabled young people who would otherwise grow up to be quote unquote normal. And in the context of healthcare, and something that should probably concern people with an interest in reproductive rights in the UK, children's rights in healthcare are long established in the United Kingdom through a mechanism known as Gillick competencies, or the Gillick mechanisms, which allow children to consent to medical treatment in relation to their evolving capacity without any set age in law. This is long established. It was introduced as a way to protect some types of sexual health services and access to sexual health services and sexual education, but this applies more broadly to pretty much every aspect of healthcare for children and young people in the UK. It's extremely important for disabled children and young people in particular. And the two areas that we constantly see this being attacked on are reproductive health care, so access to abortion services in particular, and more recently, access to transition-related care, the things that transgender adolescents who are already started puberty may need to access. Now, that is a particular danger. A lot of these this whole culture war is dangerous for many children across the countries where it's active. However, the real damage and the real potential risks in the next few years are likely to be disabled children. We're already seeing in the Republic of Ireland gender affirming services for adults, never mind children and young people, beginning to restrict care for people with certain disabilities and certain health conditions. We're already seeing this in parts of Western and Northern Europe, especially in Scandinavia, and we're seeing this across. We're seeing an increased interest in this in the global context as well. This is ultimately being used as a mechanism to restrict this particular type of healthcare, and this has happened again. This has happened before, but the risk here is particularly with respect to disabled children and young people, because ultimately, these are decision-making arguments, and the thin edge of this wedge, as communicated by these movements, is using disability as a socially acceptable tug on the heartstrings to get people interested. Ultimately, this is about, as Cliona mentioned again, and an area of my own particular interest is the right to make bad decisions. This is something that is levelled against disabled children and young people and adults all of the time. It is a fundamental right that people are able to make bad decisions or decisions that other people disagree with. And we're seeing this as a present-day example of how the sort of social fear of seemingly vulnerable people making bad decisions is used to restrict whole areas of access to healthcare and basic information at the end of the day. Now, this is for people who work in the LGBT sector. This is an obvious risk to their work and to the communities that they serve, the communities that we serve. But the drum that have been banging for the last couple of years has been that this is all based on anti-disability rights. That's what it all hangs off. That's what it all relies on. And we're seeing this increasingly as a sort of a Trojan horse to get policymakers interested and to get policymakers to sort of to take the bait. And ultimately, this is good old-fashioned paternalism. It is successful at getting people interested, and that is one of the reasons it's been so successful up until this point. Now, there's a few things, if you're looking out for this sort of thing yourself, the numbers of autistic children and young people who are trans there's a higher number than the general population. There's a higher number sort of both ways. There are more trans people who are autistic, there are more autistic people that are trans. This has been understood for quite some time now, for about 15 or 20 years, depending on who you believe and what research you put faith in. This is not new. However, this is the current focus of the efforts to restrict healthcare access in the Republic of Ireland, in the UK, in Sweden, in Switzerland, in parts of the Eastern Balkans, in North America, and in parts of Latin America as well. This is all based on child safeguarding, an alarmism around safeguarding which contradicts years of established safeguarding practice, even aside from any conversations on disability. Even if you've no interest in the specific issues for disabled children and young people, we're already seeing this have a mission creep up to affecting disabled adults as well. We've already seen this in the Republic of Ireland, where, for example, clinicians are now attempting to refuse treatment of very basic healthcare services to adults with ADHD, for example, which is a huge proportion of the population within the trans community. And we're seeing this in North America and in the UK to restrict access to healthcare information to disabled adults under the idea that disabled adults are at risk of social contagion or of making bad decisions. Ultimately, this is just the same old anti-decision-making arguments used on a particular minority group. This mission creep is harder to move into education, but the main focus that we're seeing at the moment is on recognition before the law and legal gender recognition, which is how trans people are legally recognised as their gender in many countries around the world, but also healthcare. We're also seeing, and something to have continued vigilance over, is increased brazenness of collaboration with other anti-rights movements around the world. The religious right began this in the English-speaking world in the 90s, but we're now seeing this coordinated with anti-disability movements, anti-disability rights movements, and anti-abortion movements in a way that really we haven't seen. And this is combined with, I would need about 3 hours to talk about this, but this is combined with conspiracy theory and recruitment of people online in a way that hasn't really been seen in history before. So it's very interesting, but quite alarming. This is something that I talk about on length for many hours. This is just a whistle-stop tour in 20 minutes. It's a very complicated area, but in the next probably 2 or 3 years, this is likely to be one of the most obvious uses of anti-decision-making rhetoric, anti-decision-making rights rhetoric to attack disabled children and young people in the near future, including here in Ireland. That's me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ellen, for that. Very, very live issue, obviously, as Ellen described it at the start. Very, very topical, and very, very current. And I'm sure there will be colleagues and audience members will want to have some questions for Ellen when we move to open matters from the floor. So our next and our final speaker on this morning's first panel session on equal recognition before the law is Petra Angelina. Petra is from Indonesia, and you're very welcome this morning, Petra. And Petra's here with her dad, Father Armandro. Petra has received international and national recognition for her achievements. She won an award, for example, Government Indonesian Solidarity Action Award, OASC, as an inspirational disabled person just last December. And Petra is the next member of our panel. We have a lot of panel members this morning who are authors. Petra has also published a poetry book a few years ago, back in 2017. So we'll hand you over to Petra.
Thank you. I want to talk about my life experiences as a young person with Down syndrome disability. Hi everyone, my name is Petra Angelina, but you can call me Petra. This is my outline. Number 1, introduction. Number 2, acknowledgement. Number 3, why it is important for me to make my own choices. Number 4, past experiences facing inequality. Number 5, some experiences facing fair treatment. Number 6, how people should treat me and others like me. Number 7, achievement. Number 8, conclusion and recommendation. I have Down syndrome, and I am 38 years old. My family has always been there for me since I was born. They helped me with therapy, make my thinking and movement skills better. The most important thing is that my mother taught me how to read when I was 2 years old, and I could read by myself when I was 4. I love reading books and magazines for children, and I do it a lot. Reading is my hobby. I also started writing from simple sentences to a book of poems called Suara Hati, Voice of My Heart, that I published in 2017. I am very grateful for my family's support and for being part of the YAPSD peer group. This gives me the opportunity to explore and enjoy life more. Learning and practicing my skills and talent has made a huge positive impact on how I want to live my life. I have done many things in my life. I published my first book of poems. I walked on the Jakarta Fashion Week catwalk. I performed with my hip-hop group Jista in different places, including Singapore and the Pasar Bali. And I got a chance to do a photo shoot as a model for a clothing brand. I have 4 daily and weekly activities. Some of them are physical, like walking, swimming, hiking, gymnastics, and dancing. Others are online, such as painting, learning with YAPSD, Bingo Live, Wishing, Instagram, and TikTok. I'm also proud of being a self-advocate. I could stand up and inspire other people with intellectual disabilities to be proud, confident, and have a meaningful life. What I want to tell you all is that getting early education, especially reading and writing skills, is very important. Reading a lot of books helped me learn more and know what is good and bad. Acknowledgement. I am very thankful for the chance to be part of the 14th International Disability Law Summer School by the Galway University. I am honored to share my thoughts and experiences with these distinguished audiences. I want to thank Dr. DeBerris, Ms. Sharon, Ms. Holiday, Professor Flynn, Mr. James, and everyone involved in this event. You have helped me a lot with your guidance, advice, and connection. I would not be here today without you. I also want to say thank you to my teacher, Ms. Dewi Cakrawinata of YAPSD, who taught me how to be more confident and brought me here. And to my family, especially my mom, who could not come to this event with me. Why it is important for me to make my own choices. I like to decide for myself because I can do what I love whatever I want, which makes me feel good and happy. I hope my parents would listen to me before saying yes or no to any invitation or performance opportunities. I had a bad experience once when they let me do a creative dance without knowing that I was not feeling well. I became sick and everyone in my group was worried and panicked. I don't want to make people worry about me. And this situation could have been prevented if they had asked me first. Luckily, after talking more, my parents always asked me first before accepting or rejecting any invitation. Past experiences facing inequality. I have a disability and some people are not nice to me. They do not let me do things or choose things like other young people had. Here are some of the examples. An insurance company refused me even though I have followed all the regulation. When I went to a regular school, the other kids did not play with me and the teacher did not care. So my mom moved me to another school for me. At that time, there were no inclusive schools in my area for special needs. I had to wait longer to get into the public vocal music school because they did not know if they could take me as a person with Down syndrome. My dad had to tell them that I could sing well. A man that I know through online pretended to be my boyfriend. He only wanted my money and took advantage of my disability. I was unaware he's lying until my mother told me. Some experiences facing fair treatment. On the other hand, I received some fair treatment as a person with a disability. Here are some of the examples. When I lived in Mumbai camp, Pekanbaru, Indonesia, I could go anywhere by myself. I took a taxi or bike to the store or my friend's house. I was not afraid, but not in Jakarta. I'm scared to go out alone because I feel unsafe. I went to Faneuil and Glenda Haynes Public School in New Orleans, Louisiana, USA from 1997 to 1999. The school was for everyone, an inclusive school. All students use the same school facilities. Regular students have teachers in our class that taught us to respect each other. I don't face any problem when I go to the doctor, to the bank, or other places if my parent or brother accompany me. How people should treat me and others like me. Indonesia has a law to help persons with disabilities like the UN says. But many people do not know about this law, so they do not use it. I hope the government and others will inform and apply this law more to raise people's awareness. I hope they will allow everyone to learn together in public schools, so kids can be kind to people with disabilities from a young age. I hope they will make public transportation safe, easy, and accessible for people with disabilities who travel alone. Some of my achievements include winner of freestyle swimmer on Special Olympics Indonesia 2010, performing as main dancers in Singapore Art Festival with my group. I published my poem book, appointed by UN Women to voice my opinion on what justice means. As speaker inside event Escape 2022, awarded by OASA, Government of Indonesian Ministries Coalition Organization in 2022 as Inspirational Disability Person. As speaker in YPSD event. These are my conclusion and recommendation. It is important to have opportunity and access in earlier learning, especially on speech, reading, and writing in order to get broader knowledge and ability that could make us feel more confident. We hope to get the same rights and opportunities and fair treatment in all situations, no matter what our condition is. We have to educate ourselves on our rights and ask others to respect them. We want others to listen to us and to include us. Persons with disabilities should be treated equally in all areas of life. Persons like me don't know about the human right. They are treated badly and never know their own potential. They miss out and society misses out. Access to justice is very important because it to be treated fairly, to feel safe from harm and bullying when in the public space. How would you feel knowing people but see you as an easy target for violence and crime? Perpetrators are hardly ever punished. This is especially frightening me as a woman. I feel privileged to be here to speak to you about my experiences in my life as a young person with Down syndrome disability, because I have a supportive family that support my participation, education so I can read and write, organizations like YPSD who support my learning in my adulthood. Thank you for listening to my speech and have a great day, guys. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Petra. That was showing off a very, I think, formidable array of talents that Petra had there, the power of her lived example, from swimming in the Special Olympics to her dancing feats, as I said, to publishing poetry, to being a speaker at an event, almost intimidatingly high range of achievements from Petra. And in particular, I think throughout her presentation, but in particular at the end, Petra was highlighting in the conclusions and recommendations the power of education, early learning and access, and the opportunity, the support of her family and a supportive family, supportive organisations. And in particular, I think what's pertinent brings us back to equal recognition before the law. There may be laws in Indonesia that the state has passed, but there's a lack of broader awareness of legislation and rights, and therefore a lack of application of them.